In the spring of 1945, when the fate of the Third Reich was already sealed, Hitler made a desperate decision that surprised even the Soviet command. Instead of defending Berlin, the Führer sent his best tank army to distant Hungary. The reason was simple: oil. Without this black gold, the German military machine would have stopped in weeks. Thus began one of the most dramatic operations of the final stage of the war, the Battle for Austria, in which the best forces of both sides clashed. By February 1945, the strategic situation for Germany had deteriorated catastrophically. On February 20, 3 days after the elimination of the last pockets of enemy resistance in the Hungarian capital, the Soviet headquarters of the Supreme High Command issued a directive to conduct a new large-scale operation. The Second and Third Ukrainian fronts were ordered to destroy Army Group South, complete the liberation of Hungarian lands, and capture the Austrian capital. The operation was originally scheduled to begin in mid-March. However, in the last days of February, intelligence reported the unexpected appearance in Hungary of the 6th SS Panzer Army, one of the most combat-ready armored formations of the Wehrmacht. The commander of this elite formation was General Josef Sepp Dietrich, a veteran of the party who in the past led the personal guard of Adolf Hitler. When Marshal Fyodor Tolbkin, commander of the Third Ukrainian Front, informed Moscow of the arrival of Dietrich's army, the general staff could hardly believe this information. It was completely incomprehensible why the German command had transferred such a valuable unit from the Western Front not to the threatened Berlin, but against the Ukrainian fronts.
The explanation lay in the oil fields of Western Hungary. At the beginning of 1945, these fields provided up to 80% of the total fuel reserves of the Reich. Hitler was literally obsessed with preserving this vital source of fuel. He repeatedly convinced his generals that the loss of Hungarian oil meant an imminent defeat in the war. Therefore, it was necessary to break through the Soviet defenses at all costs and drive the Russian armies back across the Danube. In turn, the Red Army leadership was aware of the enemy's intentions and was preparing to stop his last major offensive. On March 6, 1945, at 4 in the morning, the German operation, codenamed Spring Awakening, began. The main attack was carried out from the area between Lakes Balaton and Velensee by the forces of Dietrich's army. However, the lightning breakthrough that the German command had hoped for did not happen. On the first day, the infantry and SS tanks, under the deadly fire of Soviet artillery, were able to advance only a few kilometers. The losses were terrible, but the operation was not canceled. The weather conditions also worked against the attackers. The 45-ton Panthers and the even heavier 60-ton Tigers struggled through the sodden ground. Nevertheless, by March 8th, there was a real threat of a breakthrough of the Soviet positions. Tolbkin, contrary to the classical canons of the Red Army military doctrine, refused immediate counterattacks on the advancing enemy and relied on active defense. It was based on the latest Soviet Su-100 self-propelled guns, which were covered by motorized infantry and tanks. Anti-tank batteries are located at all commanding heights, providing artillery superiority on the battlefield. Fortunately, the Soviet troops withstood the onslaught of elite SS divisions. On March 9th, the headquarters clarified the tasks for the forces stationed in Hungary. No later than a week later, units of the Third Ukrainian Front were to launch an offensive against Vienna without an operational pause.
The operation plan called for a flank attack on the 6th SS Panzer Army in the area between the lakes. It was impossible to allow the withdrawal of German units to lines convenient for defense in the mountainous regions of Western Hungary and Austria. Otherwise, the war could drag on for months. In addition, a successful defense of Vienna would allow the German command to transfer tank reserves from Austria to Berlin. Therefore, the early liberation of the Austrian territories became a priority for the Red Army. By March 15th, the Germans had suffered significant losses in the Lake Balaton area and went on the defensive. The moment has come for a retaliatory strike and the defeat of the SS group. However, from the very beginning of the offensive on March 16th, everything did not go according to plan. A thick fog enveloped the battlefield. Artillery could not fire accurately, aviation could not take off, and infantry could not attack. It was only in the evening that the troops of the Third Ukrainian Front, after an hour of artillery preparation, were able to launch an offensive. In addition to the fog and difficult terrain conditions, another serious problem was the acute shortage of armored vehicles. As a result, on the first day, the Red Army advanced only a few kilometers, and the pace of advance was rapidly falling. Tolbukin was forced to apply to the headquarters with a request to transfer the 6th Guards Tank Army to him. However, he received only about 50 self-propelled artillery units, of which 12 vehicles burned down on the first day of the fighting. The slow development of the offensive forced the Soviet command to make adjustments to the initial plan of operation. Stalin realized his mistake and transferred additional forces from the Second Ukrainian Front to Tolbukin. The transfer of reinforcements took 2 days. During this time, it was necessary to bring troops to the front and create the minimum necessary conditions for their deployment. Before the boiler closed, the troops of the Soviet 9th Guards Army had only 10 kilometers to go.
On the evening of March 19th, intelligence reported to Marshal Tolbukin about the beginning of an accelerated withdrawal of tank divisions from the threat of operational encirclement. On the night of March 21st, Soviet units almost closed pincers around Dietrich's army. They were separated by only 2.5 kilometers. At the same time, Dietrich positioned the most combat-ready tank units in the narrow neck of the bag. Into this corridor, shot through by Soviet artillery, SS formations rushed in a continuous stream. The opportunity to encircle the 6th SS Panzer Army was missed. Nevertheless, the rapid retreat forced the German units to abandon a large number of armored vehicles, which were left without fuel. By March 25th, it became clear that the German armed forces were no longer in control of the situation between Lake Balaton and Lake Valence. General Heinz Guderian called this battle the grave of the German tank forces. The Germans were rapidly retreating in a northwesterly direction. Hitler flew into a rage and blamed Dietrich for the failures. However, he was not punished. Instead, he was ordered to defend Vienna and continue withdrawing troops to the Austrian capital. Having failed to encircle the SS army south of Balaton, Marshal Tolbukin decided to pursue the enemy and defeat him north of the lake. Stavka strongly objected to the submitted plans for the development of the operation. The pursuit of Dietrich's army would lead to mountainous areas on the border between Hungary and Austria. As a result, Tolbukin was instructed to turn the front in a completely different direction. The Soviet commander was given 2 tasks: to capture the oil fields south of Balaton and to advance on the Hungarian city of Sopron. It was the shortest route to the Austrian capital, so the city was called the Key to Vienna.
On the road from Sopron, Dietrich's army was retreating deep into Austria. However, the Germans no longer had enough time to create any reliable defense. In addition, fuel for armored vehicles has run out. The crews blew up their vehicles and joined the infantry units. Almost the entire area where the 6th SS Panzer Army was located was literally littered with abandoned German tanks and self-propelled guns. On March 30, 1945, the Red Army entered the territory of Austria, and on April 1, units of the 1st Guards Mechanized Corps under the command of General Rushanov captured the city of Sopron. Thus, the road to Vienna was open. 70 kilometers remained to go to it. The German command intended to defend Vienna until the last possible opportunity. The fall of the city meant the fall of the whole of Austria as a powerful military arsenal of the Reich. hundreds of tanks and armoured vehicles, thousands of artillery pieces, and up to 750 aircraft rolled off the assembly lines of Austrian factories every month. In addition, Austria had the last oil sources. At the same time, the Austrian capital was the largest transport hub connecting Central Europe with the Balkans and the Mediterranean. The city was supposed to become a fortress in the south and delay the advance of Soviet troops to the southern regions of Germany for a long time. On April 2, 1945, Hitler declared Vienna a defense area of the Reich. The battle had to be fought to the last man. Continuous lines of trenches and anti-tank ditches with barriers were hastily created on the approaches to the city and its outskirts. Artillery batteries and tanks have taken up combat positions at road junctions and commanding heights. Barricades were erected at all entrances to the city, and rubble blocked the streets in the city itself.
A powerful stream of Soviet troops rushed from Hungary to Austria through the so-called Vienna Gate. 400,000 soldiers, 400 tanks, 7,000 guns and rocket artillery installations. The troops of the Third Ukrainian Front were advancing on Vienna. The 6th SS Army was to play a key role in the defense of the city, which, despite significant losses in men and equipment, still maintained its combat capability. In addition to her, a number of well-trained divisions of various formations left for Austria. Meanwhile, the Red Army units reached the outskirts of Vienna. General Dietrich expected the main attack of the Soviet troops from the south and concentrated the main group there. Marshal Tolbukin studied the situation and made an unexpected decision: to capture Vienna by launching simultaneous attacks from the southeast and northwest. At the same time, Tolbukin took into account that the troops of Marshal Malinowski's Second Ukrainian Front are located on the northern bank of the Danube, which can also strike the northern part of the city. On April 5th, the assault on the Austrian capital began. On the southeastern outskirts of Vienna, soldiers of the 4th Guards Army met fierce resistance from SS soldiers. Intense street fighting began. The counterattacks followed one another. Everywhere, the path was blocked by barbed wire, barricades, and minefields. At the same time, units of the 9th Guards Army successfully broke through in the northwestern direction. By the evening of April 6th, the troops of the 6th Guards Tank Army, having made a deep detour, overcame the Vienna forest, reached the western approaches to the city, and then to the southern bank of the Danube. Thus, the German group was surrounded on 3 sides.
Stubborn fighting began in Vienna. The Red Army soldiers fought in the maze of streets of an unfamiliar city. The Germans fired heavily from alleys, intersections, and buildings, from basements and attics. Special assault groups were sent into battle to combat them. As a rule, they consisted of a squad of sappers, a platoon of machine gunners supported by a self-propelled gun or a tank. Since every now and then it was necessary to break down the doors, each fighter carried a crowbar, pickaxe, or axe in addition to standard weapons. House after house was checked for ambushes and snipers. The fighting did not stop even at night. The buildings were stormed by mortar fire on the upper floors and roofs. This forced the Germans to descend to the lower floors, where they were hit by direct artillery fire. Soviet tanks moved behind the assault groups at a distance of 50 meters so that they could not be reached by Faust cartridges. The Soviet command sought to minimize the use of aviation and heavy artillery in Vienna in order to protect the Austrian capital. As a result, the brunt of the fighting for the city fell on the shoulders of the infantry. By April 10th, Soviet units had captured the central quarters of Vienna and reached the Danube Canal. This artificial reservoir, 50 meters wide, with granite-lined shores about 7 meters high, posed a serious obstacle to the advancing Red Army.
Buildings stood close to the canal, from which both small arms and Faust cartridges were fired. Soviet units used trusses of blown-up bridges, planks, and logs to cross the canal. Under cover of fire, the fighters moved to the northern shore and stormed the enemy's fortifications.
The island between the Danube Canal and the Danube River gave the Soviet command a unique chance to break through to the rear of the defending Germans. Rusyanov's 1st Guards Mechanized Corps crossed the canal and moved forward. The successful advance was due to the fact that there were almost no massive buildings and narrow streets on the island, only forests and parks. By the evening of April 10, the German garrison was trapped on 3 sides. In order to bring the remnants of the broken units to the north bank of the Danube, the Nazis had to hold the only remaining bridge, the Reichsbrücke, Imperial Bridge, at all costs, and then blow it up. The bridge was mined even before the approach of the Red Army to Vienna. As soon as the Germans retreated from the city center, the bridge would have blown up and the Red Army would have been left unable to cross the Danube. The first 2 attempts to storm the bridge by the landing forces of the Danube military flotilla ended in failure. There was still hope that by some miracle they would be able to break through to the crossing through the maze of city streets. Rusyanov's building was the closest to the bridge. A group of scouts, sappers, and motorized riflemen was allocated from it to mine the bridge, which eventually managed to save the Imperial Bridge from the explosion. A wedge was driven into the German defense. The headquarters of the 6th SS Panzer Army came under fire. As a result, General Dietrich was ordered to retreat across the Danube, which he did. By the end of April 13, after the last units of the 6th SS Panzer Army had withdrawn from Vienna, the remnants of Dietrich's army retreated further west and eventually surrendered to American forces. By noon on April 13, Vienna was completely cleared of German troops. Tolbukin personally reported to Stalin about the capture of the city. On the Marshal's account, it was already the 5th European capital in which he took part. During the battles for the Austrian capital, the Wehrmacht suffered heavy losses. More than 130,000 soldiers and officers were captured.
Although many Austrians were loyal to Hitler and served in the Wehrmacht, the majority of the country's population welcomed Soviet soldiers as liberators. More than 18,000 Red Army soldiers gave their lives for the liberation of Vienna. As a result of the Vienna offensive, Germany lost control over the western regions of Hungary and eastern Austria, with their sources of strategic raw materials, food, and industrial enterprises. 2 weeks later, on April 27, 1945, the restoration of the Republic of Austria was proclaimed in Vienna, and the national flag was hoisted over the Parliament building. The Vienna operation was one of the last major offensive operations of the Red Army in Europe. The defeat of the 6th SS Panzer Army and the loss of Austria finally deprived the Third Reich of its last strategic resources and brought its final defeat closer.